Hey everyone, Joey here, aka Animus, and today I am going to be talking about the new Orbital album, Optical Delusion. Is a sentence I actually just said. You probably already know if you watch my channel that ever since I discovered them like 7 odd years ago, the massively influential techno duo of brothers Paul and Phil Hartnell has always been among my absolute favourite musical acts of all time. Can you tell? I made a couple of videos on the guys before, so I don't want to give too much prelude, but I have written 2,000 words of notes for this review, so don't hold your breath for a short video. Their whole 90s output makes for some of the most spectacular listening that electronic music has to offer. Orbital 2 and Insides would without a doubt land somewhere in my top 10 favourite albums of all time. As I'm sure you know if you're a fan of the band, their history's been kind of complicated. 2 breakups have meant that their 21st century output has been very sporadic and sparse. You often have to wait a pretty long time for a new Orbital album now, and this one is no exception. Their last full-length LP, Monsters Exist, came out 5 years ago now, which is kind of insane to me because I still vividly remember going out after school to HMV to buy Monsters Exist as a little year 7. For me, Orbital albums at their absolute worst are very good, and Monsters Exist was yet another fantastic album in my opinion. It felt like the soundtrack to some oncoming apocalypse, with eerie vocal lines and booming synths, but this was contrasted by elements that were kind of whimsical, danceable, and bizarre. In other words, evil circus music. Thankfully they didn't disband for a 3rd time afterwards, but the 10th Orbital album felt like it was hiding somewhere out of sight for a number of years. The Pentaveret score and Paul's excursions into both horror film music and COVID-era comedic spoken word were inessential, if nice to see as reminders of their presence. Their solid 30-something compilation featured 2 original new tracks, one of which I really liked, in Smiley, but it wasn't until October of last year that we finally saw a proper new Orbital single along with the announcement of their upcoming album, Optical Delusion. That single being Dirty Rat featuring Sleaford Mods, which I made a full video on along with my anticipatory thoughts for this album, if that's a word. It came as a bit of a surprise, but I had overall positive feelings. The whole thing felt really surreal to me, and I kind of had measured excitement for the new album. It looked to be quite poppy. I anticipated having a lot of short and vocal-led tracks. My feelings weren't really changed by the second single, Ring a Ringer, which didn't get much of a strong reaction out of me. But then there was Are You Alive, and I will get to that one later. So, at last, a few weeks back, I finally sat down and listened to Optical Delusion in full. And what did we get with the 10th Orbital album? Well, it certainly wasn't a disappointment. It kind of feels like the spiritual successor to Monsters Exist, down to its grotesque artwork. I like to imagine that if that album was the warning of an apocalypse, then this time the monsters have taken over and are wreaking havoc upon the world. It was put together in an interesting way. It's more of a kind of joint Paul and Phil Hartnell album, where each of the tracks is made by one of them, but not both of them. Though I imagine this wasn't out of any animosity, and more just the way they both felt like putting the album together. And this could have led to a slightly scattershot listen, but the more times I hear this album, the more cohesive it all feels. There's lots of variety, and despite a slightly rocky moment here and there, it really does feel like a tightly sequenced listen, and one that tells a story from start to finish. I've always finished this album feeling satisfied, with overall positive feelings toward the whole experience, and it's absolutely sustained my enjoyment throughout the 5 full listens I've given it so far. So I think it's about time to go down individual tracks on this album. We open with the aforementioned Ring a Ringer, the old pandemic folk song featuring the medieval babes. Who else? I think it's quite apt to have one COVID-related track placed at the beginning of the record. Though this album was likely produced throughout the pandemic, it definitely doesn't overall feel linked to that time, aside from this one piece. I was definitely intrigued to see this feature when I was looking at the track listing. They contribute a ghostly refrain of course, Ring a Ring the Roses, though as mentioned before, what would otherwise be quite unsettling to listen to is balanced out by a playful and light-hearted instrumental. Now, I still don't quite find myself loving this track. The production does feel a little bit off in a way I can't quite put my finger on, aside from the fact that the beat sort of slices through the mix in a bit of an excessive way. But technical gripes aside, I enjoy pretty much all of the elements that go into this track. It's a fun tone setter, it sticks in your head, and I much prefer an album that gets better over time than one that shoves all of its best tracks at the beginning. And getting better over time is exactly what this album does right away with the track Day One. This track initially seemed like it might have a similar mixing problem, but as everything builds up, it feels so massive and crisp and booming. Dina Ipavic, I think I pronounced that right, adds what I believe are foreign language vocals, although, as with a couple of other collaborators on this album, I failed to find much information at all on them. Anyway, her additions kind of make this track feel almost like the night to Belfast's Day. It contains definitely one of the most memorable tunes on the album. It's a fantastic cut. And then we get Are You Alive featuring Penelope Isles. I pretty much fell in love with this track on first listen, and my feelings remain unchanged. It's more or less a clear cut as my favourite track on the album, and my favourite of 2023 so far. It builds up so much over time, beginning with Lily Walters' airy vocals and a minimal beat, before it flies upwards into an anthemic chorus with surprisingly cutting lyrics. I genuinely wasn't expecting to hear an F-word on an Orbital track. Some of these harmonies, though, just make my hairs stand on end. And around the 5-minute mark, just as you'd expect the track to be drawing to a close, suddenly in comes this 4-to-the-floor pulse and a heavy bass line gathering momentum, building up into an almost trance-like instrumental passage, and oh my god, I was just so on board. I talked in my previous Orbital video about their symphonicness being one of the main draws to their music for me, and getting so far into the track and then suddenly bringing in a section like this was just such an old Orbital move that solidified this as a modern great from the band, reminding me of just what made me fall in love with their music in the first place, while still feeling very much contemporary. This track has just been randomly getting stuck in my head for days, and I honestly think it might be my favourite thing they've done since Where Is It Going? I also mentioned in my Dirty Rat video my hunger for lengthy Orbital cuts, and at nearly 8 minutes long, this definitely satisfies that craving. It is though the only track on the album which breaches the 6-minute mark, and I do kind of wish we got more of this type of track on the album, but obviously length is not a direct indicator of quality, so just me, you know. Maybe we'll see a full-on epic someday again. Anyway, the next track is You Are the Frequency, which is the first of 3 fill cuts on this album. Its placement directly after Are You Alive is a little bit unflattering, and I'll admit on first listen this track didn't do much for me. I still find it to have the most clear issues on the album, but I've grown to enjoy this one a fair bit. The deadpan voices saying the title are shoved right to the front of the mix, and they do have a bit of an ugly vocoder effect on them at one point. And also the electronic pianos used at some points on this track are strangely 90s trance sounding, by which I mean a little cheap for an Orbital track, but then that leads me to believe that Phil probably was deliberately going for this kind of pastiche sound. I don't know what Phil's thinking sometimes. It does have a fun, memorable melody and a driving beat, and the moment he brings in a gnarly 303, most of my problems feel like they go away. In this track and in life. Bit of a WTF moment initially, but I've grown to find its all over the placeness kind of endearing. Phil was definitely bringing strong chaotic neutral energy to this album, and I'm happy to say it's basically smooth sailing from here. All of the rest of the tracks on the album are good to great in my opinion. Just to clarify, I do consider Ring a Ringer and You Are the Frequency to be good. I just mean that the quality bar is kept really consistently high from here on. The new Abnormal is such a classic Orbital track. It's got those instantly recognizable vowel-like synths and a playful lead melody, breakbeats that are layered in a super satisfying way. Feels kind of like a Lost Brown album track with added modern sparkle and punch. It's a definite highlight, and I imagine if you've been a fan of the band since the 90s, then you'll be especially happy to hear a track like this. Home is the second lyric-led cut, featuring Anna B. Savage, who I don't personally listen to, but seems to be a pretty relevant artist at the moment. She just recently put out a new LP. This is one of the darkest tracks on the album tonally. It's an example of their political side, which is still very much on the pulse and left-leaning. It's very typical for Orbital these days to include a topical track like this on an album. I mean, Orbital albums have kind of always had an underlying political message to them. Look no further than Snivelization and the Criminal Justice Bill, or Insides and Environmentalism. I probably could have gone into greater depth about how Monsters Exist and Optical Delusion are both really unified statements, but there's another review of that. And they're not light-footed with these themes either. This track basically talks of overthrowing urbanization using imagery of plants growing over the ruins of dead cities. Perhaps there's tracks on the album that pop out at you more, but this is a pretty moving piece that feels very focused. Both Savage and the duo seem like their hearts are fully in it, and it comes across as much more natural and in touch than you might expect such a track to be from a duo who have been going at it for 3 decades. No offense, Orbital, I love you guys. You are my parents' generation, though. It holds a very important place in the album's track listing, and I can definitely give it my recommendation. And then we get the above-mentioned Dirty Rat, and in complete contrast, this track could hardly have any more geezer energy. Basically another F the Tories track, but way more light-hearted than Home. Look, it's called Dirty Rat. And yeah, hearing this multiple times in the context of the album, I have come to the slow realization that I kind of love this track. Its punkness is such a change of pace in the context of the LP, and where specifically it lies in the track listing, giving its thumping beats a ton of impact. Basically a tried and true rave banger with added spice, and everyone involved is clearly having an absolutely amazing time. I cannot wait to see this go down live next month. Moving into the final stretch of the album, Requiem for the Pre-Apocalypse is another clear standout. It's got these driving, gritty breakbeats with eerie vocals haunting the peripheries, which give way to ethereal pads and a more hopeful melody before the darkness ultimately seems to win out. Sort of like short form Are We Here with a cliffhanger ending. Of course, unlike Are We Here, it's not one of my absolute favourite electronic music pieces ever made, but it's excellent nonetheless. And finally, we get a kind of diptych of fill tracks to close out the album, and here we very much said goodbye to the pre-apocalypse. These tracks are nuts. What a Surprise, featuring again the Little Pest, is clattering, mechanical, chaotic, featuring unintelligible vocal stutters and a trap beat. On paper this should be way too much, but in practice it's so sonically overwhelming that it turns out to be a ton of fun. I'd understand if you didn't enjoy this one very much. It's a very The Altogether type track. And in fact I've seen both of these tracks as a pair compared to Meltdown, and how it ends that album with dizzying organised chaos. This track is a surprise, and a welcome one. And finally there's Moon Princess, featuring the so-called godmother of Japanese electronic music, Koppei, who lends both production and haunting vocals, do we sense a pattern, in her native language. She then gets kind of looped all over the place on top of a lurching off-kilter beat, before in comes one of the gnarliest, most twisted bass lines I've ever heard Orbital create. Like a giant electronic tuba in a metal container, with these robotic voices saying, trying to make rational decisions despite existing in an irrational universe. It all layers into something rather tense and unsettling, and then kind of ends without much fanfare. Well, initially I thought I might have liked some kind of explosive finish to this album. I've come to appreciate how it ends feeling a bit up in the air and unresolved, like the apocalypse is still ongoing. and this baffling final pair of tracks have definitely contributed to this album's replay value for me. Now this is where the main album ends, but before I give my concluding thoughts, I would like to give a quick mention to some bonus tracks from various releases of the album. On the Amazon exclusive CD, there's 2 original tracks from Paul. There's The Crane, a moody and atmospheric cut featuring some pretty piano work, and Dina Ipavik again being given a more front and center vocal performance and a chance to shine. Almost sounds a little bit like Alison Goldfrapp here, which is obviously a plus. Then Year of the Bat, where bright ambience melts into an expansive banger with an anthemic lead melody. And one track by Phil, Lost in Time, which takes more of a down-tempo approach with atmospheric washes, a sparse beat, and a blipping melody somewhat reminiscent of his Two Square side project with Vince Clarke. None of these tracks are a step down in quality from the main album and are all worth your time. I don't know if I'd replace any album tracks with one of these, and if they were simply added to the track listing, then they might mess with the tight pacing a bit, but they're great addendums to the main album. Shout out also to the French language version of Are You Alive featuring Clue, which is featured on the website exclusive bonus CD. It's strange and cool that this exists. It mostly just does what it says on the tin, but it also has an unexpected alternate ending with swung beats and vibrant arpeggios, so it makes for a fun little curiosity. I've even heard some people say they prefer this version. Anyway, my concluding thoughts on Optical Delusion. I feel I've struggled to convey with words exactly how they make this album fit together, but despite a good amount of tonal and stylistic variety, and the separation between Paul and Phil tracks being quite pronounced when you know which is which, listening to Optical Delusion front to back, it just works for me. There's definitely sounds and collaboration choices that feel like new additions to the Orbital universe, but it still also feels like the same Orbital we've always known and loved, just making Orbital music with whatever technology happens to be around at the time. And through the album's twists, turns, and surprises, there's a sense of warm familiarity that I welcome with open arms. Even if I hope they get in the studio together next time, I'm so happy to have Orbital back making new music as a band, and it really comes across like they had a great time making Optical Delusion and were creatively fired up throughout its production process, which is fantastic to see. And for this reason, my hopes are pretty high that more exciting new Orbital material shouldn't be too far off. I'd definitely rather they kept having fun trying new things and made a couple of You Are the Frequencies along the way than stuck to their guns and kept making the same track. Though it may not quite be as consistent as Monsters Exist in my opinion, this album hits even higher peaks for me personally. So overall, Optical Delusion is a very satisfying listen and a worthy addition to the Orbital pantheon. It's probably my second or third least favourite album of theirs. By which I mean it's almost certainly my favourite album of 2023 so far. I fully recommend checking it out, and I'm overall feeling a Sounds of Nerdy Joy out of 10. Or a light 8.5. Just before I go, I'd like to give a mention, of course, to the Wonky Angle who got me into these guys in the first place, and wider electronic music outside of Avicii as a whole. I've seen he's recently put out a 40-minute long review of this album, which I am so excited to watch. I recommend you check it out because the depth of his analysis will probably be like 10 times better than mine. But for now, thank you for watching. See you next time.